My name is Brendan McGinty, and thank you for joining us. I'm part of leadership for the Center for AI Innovation here at the university within NCSA, National Center for Supercomputing Applications. As is typical with seminars like this, over the lunch hour, people will trickle in. As you have questions for our featured speaker this morning, go ahead and put them in chat. Feel free to ask at the conclusion, raise a hand so that we can pipe you in. We'll get the questions answered at the conclusion of Brian's presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our featured speaker. We just could not possibly be more happy to have a colleague of ours and a valued partner of ours that represents AbbVie with us. Brian Martin joined AbbVie in October of 2018 as the head of the newly formed Raiders team within Research and Development's Information Research Division, focused on accelerating, scaling, and amplifying the work of AbbVie's R&D community using AI technologies like machine learning, deep learning, and cognitive computing. Brian came to AbbVie after spending 5 years in technology consulting across many industries and over a decade of additional experience before that working in trading and financial markets technology. While his primary focus is AI technologies, his interests are much broader, and he has presented at multiple conferences on topics including optical networking, quantum computing, blockchain, cognitive architecture, and other emerging technology concepts that are all part of digital transformation. Brian holds a BS in computer and cognitive science from Alma College and an MS in computer science from the University of Chicago. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and I will try to be very clear with you all about the fact that we are not going to need your math skills today. We're not going to need your deep thinking around the complications of feature classification and all that kind of stuff. We're going to talk about something at a very different level. But I think that the key with that is that this level is essential for us to actually do anything with AI. And the fact is, I will go on the record saying I think AI has become a crappy catch-all term that's lost any of its significance in terms of what it really was originally meant to be. And so, as a warning, my presentation will be fairly sardonic at points. And it's meant more than anything to challenge you all to be able to think about the work that you do with AI in a much broader context than simply, I got a model with an AUC of 0.58 versus 0.92. Yay, I see improvements, whatever the case may be. We need to think about the larger contexts around AI. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of tell a little bit of a story about what and how we can frame that surrounding context of AI. And then I'm going to show you some examples of how we kind of do that at AbbVie and how we've done that with our explorations into AI. So first things first, always quote smarter people when you start a presentation, and in this case, more creative people. When we think about AI, don't be the person who develops that model with the cord not being quite long enough. And that will come out hopefully clearly in this message. We need to think about this context, this larger scope for what we're trying to develop and deploy. And then I hope you're all ready, but let's play some buzzword bingo as part of this presentation. Give you an idea of how many different terms that we're going to throw out there. We put this kind of grid, bingo grid. It's always fun to play. Of course, you'll probably get bingo in the first 60 seconds of this presentation. But the case is one of the reasons I love doing this. I love getting out, presenting, and sharing with academic communities, with universities. Why I love the fact that our AbbVie Innovation Center at UIUC is a resource to tap into, engage. if you don't rip yourself out of that marketing, sales, and all of that hype long enough to actually focus on why you're doing what you're doing and what the realistic challenges are, then you're going to lose the point in the first place. And so I think that um, for you folks, this is something I'm thankful to you for inviting me to come and share with you, because this is my touchstone. This gets me back to, this is really cool stuff. Even though we have to provide value and we have to build these things, it's just really cool stuff at the heart of it. The science and the math and the technology is just cool. So let's play some bingo. What is digital transformation? And we're kind of talking about why it's important. And one of the first things I want to like lay down is that AI is like this much. It's a tiny portion of all of the transformative change that's been happening over the past, let's call it a decade, just because that's easy to say. Our technology has advanced, our compute power, our processing power. Think about what's in that petascale facility, you know, over on the campus there, and think about what it would have taken 10 years ago to leverage that type of capacity and capability. AbbVie, we have our own dedicated 4,000 core system in that facility. How is that? Like 4,000 cores 10 years ago is just an insane sort of mind-boggling amount. So technology underlying to make this stuff possible has advanced amazingly. Data itself has advanced. Our understanding of data, our understanding of management of data, of the semantics and structuring. And a lot of this is old stuff becoming new again, right? We can go back a long ways and we can understand, you know, Judea Pearl and understanding causality, like basic constructs of things like that have been around for a while. But we get new leases on them when the technology enables the data, when the data enables the technology. We get new leases on that. Interestingly enough, though, humanity, we've changed, but maybe not quite as quickly. And I think we see a lot of the sort of social discretization and the differentiation between my children and myself, even in the acceptance and use of technology, because humanity as a culture changes slower. And so we're fighting that. So that's there with that the case thing. I think the key is understanding that AI is part of this larger suite of change and transformation. And we need to make sure that we understand that context, because it is all of these things together that are driving value for companies and for users in our space. And that value is driven by something called the virtuous cycle. There's three kind of key types of value that these technologies and data and people coming together can drive: operational value, experiential value, and analytical value. And most companies start with operational value because it's achieved fairly easily through efficiency. And so when we think about where AI is finding its first placehold, where that first toehold exists in spaces, is really in places where it can help improve operational efficiency, where better tools enable a return on the investment there operationally. But because of the flux of data, the influx and the deluge of data that's coming in, we move backwards around the cycle to driving analytical value next. And this is really where the modeling sort of comes into play. If I can be more precise, if I can achieve greater predictive power in this space, then I can build better tools. And so these value pieces build on each other. And ultimately, the experiential value for users, as well as how we experience the world, sensors, IoT, to yield better data. All of these things work together, creating this feedback cycle, and that drives momentum. And when we think about the function for calculating momentum, it's mass and velocity, right? Well, the AI tools that we have enable us to do things at greater scale. The technology tools enable us to do things at greater mass, and they enable us to do things faster than a human brain can in some ways calculate. So velocity, it really truly is, these technologies in this virtuous cycle are driving momentum. But the key here is that we always need to change and guide that with our own human experience and empathy, an understanding of the world and the context in which this happens. And one key tenet is that I hold dear is that human judgment is sacrosanct. We will never build AI models at AbbVie that take away human judgment. We'll differentiate judgment from decision making at some times and in some ways. Decision making based on specific fixed thresholds, which someone has made a judgment about, is different than an AI making a judgment based off of some pure probability curve or probability base. So that judgment of choosing to take an action which yields an impact is something we reserve for human folks. And it's a gray, kind of murky line there. I understand there's no real hard, precise boundary there. But it is an area where we feel very strongly it helps us manage a lot of the challenges around model bias, raw challenges around sort of the ethics that are an unexplored and fairly nascent part of use of these models in an established sense. And so for us, really embracing the cycle gives us energy we don't have because we don't have a lot of time. And it lets us do two things. It gives us IA and AI, intelligent automation and augmented intelligence. And when Brendan introduced me, the team that I run at AbbVie is called the Raiders, stands for Rapid Automation and Insight Delivery and Exploration for Research and Science. So a bit of an acronym mouthful, but it's not about artificial intelligence. It's about automation and insights. It's about automating, climbing the ladder of inference in a good fashion, in a proper way. So with all of that said, in the context, let's talk about space, the final frontier. And here's your obligatory Star Trek reference for folks who need one. But I actually think that this is a fairly good example of why the space model and framework I'm going to talk about quickly is so important. Because one thing is you can always tell a Starship Enterprise, no matter what generation it was, you can always tell based off the same basic shape, the saucer, the nacelles, the underhull area. And so one of the things about this framework, or the framework of the Enterprise, is we want to have the same thing. We want to have that same construct when we think about building our solutions, our spaceships, to carry the AI capability forward. And so space is this framework that I developed when I was doing consulting and working across a lot of different industries, but seeing a lot of them face common challenges around how do I build platforms that use AI and cognitive computing and these other types of capabilities. And so I came up with this sort of framework as just a let's tick the boxes to make sure that we think about all the different components and pieces that are necessary to bring an AI model into fruition and to actually provide value. And it's a little bit daunting when we step through here. You'll see how many non-AI things, how many non-model things are or could or should be part of solution development. And so the 5 main layers here are an experience layer, an intelligence layer, an operations layer, an experimentation layer, and a data and integration layer. We're going to kind of walk through those layers and the different elements of those layers really quickly here. In the data and integration layer, we have 4 key components. Data components, which is your data at rest. These are your data stores, your databases, your repositories. And as we move forward, those are moving from relational stores to graph stores, right? Where they are changing. There's a lot of change in the way that we think about storing data and these data components to think about. We've got our enterprise integrations. And so this is it's touch points within an enterprise, within a scope of controlled access and authentication and authorization. And it's focused on the data in motion concerns. How do I move data between systems? How do I bring that data back and forth? Outside integrations is the flip side of the enterprise. It's the same data in motion, but where those access controls and the veracity of the data in many cases is not assured because it's coming from an external system. And so there are some interesting risks and considerations if your model is based on data from outside integrations that you need to be thinking about and how that plays into it. And then lastly is the security and identity integrations that are self. And this is important to tracking change and tracking use and many other sides of that, obviously. From the experimentation layer, this is generally where you think about your model building happening, right? So there is a totally frequently missed concept, which is the idea management side. We keep a backlog of stories anytime we're doing development projects of work to be done. We don't do that for ourselves with ideas very often. You don't have that list of where you jot down, oh, I wonder if this is worth exploring. Oh, I wonder if this is worth exploring. And then systematically go through that, groom that backlog of ideas to start exploring them and to start driving a methodology around how you engage in data science, as a process around validating those ideas. Model management. How do we version and manage these models we're actually doing? How do we track that? Knowledge engines and cognitive processors that we build, how are we actually managing that, testing those and giving ourselves the historical base to be able to say this model is improving or it is not. It is declining in its performance over time. Um, Obviously, the toolbox and sandbox where we're doing the actual development of the models. How are you doing that in your development environment in this experimentation space? Is that aligned with the tools and the components that are going to need to exist outside that space within the enterprise as a whole? And then verification and validation. What are the mechanisms we're putting in to monitor our models for bias, to manage the performance of those models, to track it over time, and to actually keep the statistical histories and the records and histories around those. The intelligence layer this is where the meat and potatoes goes if you're thinking about AI models, right? Do you have an orchestration service that manages requests to and from various different forms of models? Think of if your models themselves are knowledge services, how do you know which model to use in a given scenario or a given space? So the knowledge service management space is that orchestration around that. Ontology management, we need to manage the semantics. We need to manage these taxonomies around the data so that we can bring that data together in new ways to drive creation of newer, more powerful models. This is one of the most challenging spaces in an enterprise data or knowledge platform development effort. Cognitive processors, these are things that generally take unstructured data and bring it into structured form. So think about your traditional CV, your vision algorithms, or natural language processing algorithms. These are things that are trying to take that unstructured and perform a cognitive action on it. I'm trying to understand relationships from the data I'm presented with in that unstructured form. And the knowledge engines are more of your traditional machine learning or deep learning models, doing a prediction task or a classification task, anything in that sort of thing. And this is that sort of core, your models and what you're building and running type of space. The operations layer, this is how we actually make it do stuff in production, right? What's your deployment platform? Think the DevOps, ML ops sort of side of this, of actually taking those models and deploying them so that they can scale, so that they integrate, so that they're managed and monitored in the right way. Command and control. How do you have enough stuff in place to be able to shut down your model or start it up, as the case may be? If you remember Tay, the Microsoft naughty chatbot that came a huge issue, right? Well, part of the issue Microsoft had was when they built it and got it ready to deploy, they didn't have a mechanism they didn't have a kill switch. They actually had to deconstruct a whole bunch of some of their infrastructure to stop it once it had started getting off the rails. And so building in command and control infrastructures is really important around that space. Reporting, right? We like to see summaries. We'd like to see aggregations of reports. And so thinking about how when you're operating a platform with these things, how are the reporting components going to be part of that picture? And then the monitoring, right? So this is the real time. If reports are the post facto, monitoring is that near real time view. What's happening right now? How can I see how my model is working as part of the system or platform it's in? right now at any given point in time. And the last and probably one of the most important parts is this experience layer. And this is a little bit of a vagary in some cases for folks who don't build solutions for users, but build just a model. And the idea is there are specific tools and techniques to monitoring and maintaining and managing the user's experience, being able to make sure that the users are engaging with the platform and with the tools in ways that is giving them value in that experience. And then there's content management. How are we managing the actual output from my model? If my model is generating an image, let's say I've built a GAN and I'm generating an image that's going to be presented to a user, image caching. How do I handle the distribution, the content distribution network parts and components of the whole picture of building a solution? That's an important construct because that can take up a lot of space, and that can lead to a lot of inefficiencies and breakdowns in the user experience if we don't think about that. The user interfaces themselves. How does a user interface to a model? Because it isn't with a REST API and it's not a command line, right? It's got to be something for users that engages with them in the right way. And then the last part is user experience components. So this is, how do I think about that user interface being able to provide consistent experiences across channels? Whether I'm on a web page interacting with a model and it's presenting responses to me, or I'm in a chat window, I'm in a conversational engagement, or whether it's an AR device that is designed to provide immediate feedback and things like that. They're all part of this stuff. And so this 5-layer 20 component framework is how you can broadly look at any given solution. And the fact is that you don't have to boil the ocean. You don't have to do it all, but it's a good map, right? And so when you stop and you look at the model, and the model as a component of how am I going to actually make this deliver value for users? How am I going to build a solution around that? Having the right components and saying, yes, I need this. No, I don't. Yes, I need this. This gives you kind of a checklist to be able to go through and see. And you very likely won't need to cover every element unless you are building a large platform designed to engage a broad set of users and be a complete released product in that way for users. But setting out with this framework around what you need to stop and think about, even when all you're doing is building the model, can help you make smarter decisions about the model itself in this case. And so anytime I talk about this framework and their structures and components, I get kind of this response from a lot of folks that, well, this is well organized and it sure is pretty, and those pastel colors are very soothing, but this just seems really impractical. Like, this just seems like this is way too much overhead and way too much work. It's like the Jira project management for, a small task kind of thing. And the fact is that if you take and you don't boil the ocean, it actually works really well. And so now I'm going to kind of show you some examples of where we've at AbbVie taken this viewpoint around some of our models. So first example I'm going to give you is a case around request triage and processing. So we get in 500 to 1,000 cases a day of people saying, hey, I had an adverse event when taking one of your drug products. And we have to process those. But the fact is the significant majority of those are not qualified adverse events. They're just not. And so before, we actually had to have humans reviewing every single case to determine if it was qualified or not. And then the qualified use cases had to be reviewed by a second person who is more skilled, a medical assistant who is more skilled in the actual details in there to fill out the case detail. And so a simple classifier, qualified, non-qualified, was brought into play. But just the model itself doesn't solve the problem. How do I get the cases into the model? How do I retrain the model over time? How do I have users engage with the output of the model? And so you'll hear this human in the loop term a lot around these platforms. And so our QBot platform, or AppQ as it's called, is this whole human in the loop platform that takes in all of the cases for the day. About 500 of those get automatically processed by AbbVie, and nobody needs to tackle them anymore. Anything that the model can't classify with an appropriate probability, and we are very risk averse with that probability cost, we intentionally lose efficiency so that we reduce risk in this case. The model then is able to process through those. And in fact, one of the interesting things is we can actually now, the combination of the human in the loop and AbbVie can process a month's worth of these adverse event reports in a single day. And so this is a huge enabler for the ability for us to open up and create more volume in this space, be more clear and more declarative about our handling of safety events. Let's take transformer models. Everyone loves a good BERT. And you know, they're pretty awesome in what they can do, but how do you put them to use in a value perspective? And so one example we have something called Agent Q. And Agent Q is a question answering model. Agent Q gets as its input every new publication from a variety of sources, whether that's PubMed, whether that's arXiv, bioRxiv, any of these various different sources. And it takes a body of questions that it has been posed. And if any new publication comes out that answers that question with a high enough probability of score, it sends automatic notifications to the user who posed the question. And so you stage a question that you're interested in effectively monitoring for new information about. And Agent Q will tell you, hey, there's a new paper that came out that's talking about the link between EGFR and the production of some enzyme. And it's amazing the difference for a scientist of getting that sort of, when it happens, pinging of a possible paper of interest, as opposed to them having to go on a daily basis, scan a list based off the titles, because they're not going to read every abstract, to find the abstracts that they may want to dig into more, to be able to dig into that. And so Agent Q has really been a great example of how do you take one of these transformer models on natural language and put it to use in a platform and system. Knowledge from images is an obvious one. And in fact, the Avocado platform is based off some science that was enabled through some work at UIUC, in fact. So if we have a pill, the distribution of drug compound and buffer compounds within the pill is, these are amorphous. They form crystalline structures that are not regular. And so in looking at the quality, all the different characteristics around pill formation and the quality concerns there, how do we model that without destroying the pills? And some scientists and students at UIUC came up with a way using micro CT to actually take a pill and provide a slice, a stack of images, slices through that pill so that you can visualize it. And so what we've done is we've taken and built a platform that takes those stacks of images and builds a 3D model of the crystalline structures in there, and then does classification, because buffer compounds compress and crystallize as more flat sheets, while API drug compounds tend to compress and crystallize in globular clusters. And so if we want to characterize and quantitate the dispersion of drug compound in a pill, how do I actually calculate that? And so the Avocado platform creates these types of calculations, quantifications around a pill without the pill being destroyed. And the model actually is almost to the point where it runs fast enough that we could, in theory, deploy it as part of a manufacturing process and provide continuous quality adjustment around that. And so that's this idea of you can build this model and these capabilities into a larger system. Histopathology, looking at cells, cellular segmentation, quantification on these. There's a number of different platforms and tools that we've started building these models into to support our pathologists as they look at tissue samples, as they look at different effects on the biology of different compounds and things like that. Transform content. So this is one of the coolest and most straightforward applications of AI that I think anybody is aware of, is how do I transform one language into another? And so we've built a platform called AbbVie that has a couple different versions that we're currently working on. It has a simple version. Think like your Google Translate. You type in text, it spits out the other language, right? We have a more complicated version that's trained on highly specific language, that's trained on our models around language in this case. And so those models tend to be much larger and more precise because they're trained on that language. And then lastly, we're building in this human in the loop concept, a post-edit management front end that allows trained translators to look at what the machine is producing, make corrections, store those corrections back, and then be able to actually improve the model, the translation models continuously by feeding in that additional data. And I think the one thing that's interesting is the core model behind Abblefish in the specific detailed models is actually an 80 billion per hyperparameter transformer model. It's a fairly large model. And it's able to translate 180 different languages completely full mesh. And the way it's able to do that is instead of being trained on language pairs, which is the standard sort of, I'm going to train it on English to German. I'm going to train it on German to Spanish. I'm going to train it on Spanish to French. It's actually built using what's called an interlingua concept. The idea that I can source from any language into effectively a common language and then back out into any other language. And so that's what this model has been really powerful for, is enabling, in fact, some languages that we might only have 10 or 15 documents in that language, but we can actually enable translations out into that language in new ways. The last one, this is a great example of a couple of different models and some robotic process automation all thrown into one mix. For our structural biology process, we've got this workflow where we take a protein where we don't know the structure of the protein or its conformation, and we put that protein in a bunch of different solutions in one of these well plates, and it goes into a refrigerator where we hope that it crystallizes over time. And that refrigerator has a camera. It takes pictures of every one of these little well plates, and hopefully a crystal forms. Well, and once a crystal forms, sometimes you need to go back and re-image it to say with ultraviolet light for fluorescence to see if it's a biologic crystal versus a salt. And then once you've got a crystal, you got to pull the crystal out, put it in a little puck, dump it in liquid nitrogen. We ship it down to Argonne National Labs where they blow it up on an X-ray beam line. And they give us the electron diffraction patterns that then we use to work our way back to the actual structure of the protein in that scenario. And there's lots of places all up and down this path where we engage with different tools, whether it's a model that looks at the images and tells us what kind of crystal is in that well plate or in that individual well. And you can see on the screen the CAII platform, crystallography with human in the loop enhancement, that we built to actually automatically do that, but then provide that mechanism for users to correct the model, provide that feedback, and accelerate the ability to identify wells where we need to go in and physically remove the crystals. And then again, on the other side of this process, human in the loops to correct the predicted structures and help retrain those pieces to define the models. And some robotic process automation, because when we find a crystal, if the model highly probability predicts a crystal of a certain type, we know we want to rescan it with ultraviolet light. And so some robotic process automation, when that happens, can go back and tell the software to tell the refrigerator device, go back and rescan this specific well with UV light. So that information can then feed through as well. And so this is an example of how bringing all these things together, a lot of those facets of digital transformation can help to accelerate workflows in general. And then the last is, this is more of a broad thing, but we're trying to enable knowledge work, not just data work. We know a lot of companies talk about being data-driven. The fact is data-driven doesn't matter if you're not appropriately using knowledge and insight in the correct way. And so we're in the process of building a knowledge graph that covers all of AbbVie's R&D data, plus real-world data, plus our genomics data, plus our clinical data. And then how do we enable our scientists through graph neural networks and some of the graph algorithms that exist to be able to predict new knowledge or identify where we have assay data that may conflict with an existing publication's assertion. And so thinking in this sense, how do we build this foundational platform for knowledge work is one of our biggest engagements right now. And the knowledge graph we're building right now, the current sizing is around 13 trillion relationships and somewhere in the range of 3 to 4 billion entities within that graph. All of our compounds, all of the public compounds, clinical trials, health conditions, drugs, you name it, that are all part of this. But you can see if we can have these relationships, can we start to do things better, faster, and more precisely earlier in the research process by predicting links and that type of thing. And that is the end. When I saw this quote, I think everybody's probably heard the quote, "Make no little plans," right? And Daniel Burnham is attributed to being the origin of this quote from 1891. But I had never actually heard the full quote, right? I'd always heard the "Make no little plans." And I think when you stop and you read the full, like the quote in context, right? I'm all about context in this. And when you read the quote in context, even more, it's about build your models, but build them as part of a much bigger plan. If you're going to work on a model that predicts something, have a plan for how that's going to go into use. Have a plan, sit down and think about how is a user, how is a patient, how is a scientist, how is a doctor, how is a salesperson, a marketing person, it doesn't matter who, but how is that user going to benefit from it? Because that's what should be driving the passion and the engagement in what we're trying to do, whether it's pure science or whether it's applied science in the case of many of these things to drive value. And so, I'll leave it at this. Let your watchword be order and your beacon beauty is such a great way to, I think, tie up that we got some cool tech. We got to put it in a right framework and a right structure and scaffold if we're really going to change the world the way we really want to. And with that, I'll
Brian,
open it up.
outstanding. What a great presentation. I think talk about covering it all. Image analysis, NLP, acceleration of the workflows. One thing I hadn't heard was the knowledge workers, that kind of focus that you have. You hear about the data end of things all the time. That is the people part of this, right? Is also part of it. We have a couple of questions coming in as a reminder. Please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. Brian, if you can see the chat, sure. I'll stay out of the way and let you handle. First couple from Mohammed there.
Sure. Mohammed, the question is, how do you differentiate between adverse effect and side effects for your model? Well, depending on the different model in play, if we're talking about the pharmacovigilance and patient safety, the AppQ model that I talked about, in this case, it is only for drugs that are released on the market, right? Because the source of the data in this case is active patient reports that come into our center from doctors, from patients. And so in this case, they are all considered potential adverse events. And the definition at that point of an adverse event versus a side effect is not clear. And it's not even really necessary at that point. Where it becomes a little more interesting is when we take that same model and we try and apply that model to clinical trials. So if I've got a patient that's engaged in a clinical trial as opposed to a released product, how do I treat that? Because in that sense, the difference between something that is a true side effect that is driven and there is a causal relationship between what that patient is being prescribed or taking and an adverse event, which could be something broadly from the environment or otherwise. That's really where our statisticians and our data scientists, when they engage in the clinical trial analysis, will work to differentiate that. And then they drive that based on causality more than anything. Your second question, Mohammed, about crystallization, the pills contain the active pharmaceutical ingredients along with the excipients. How can you differentiate between the API and the excipients? This is actually, interestingly enough, when we were presented with this, we were like, well, how would you do this? Because in a two-dimensional slice, the contrast of an API versus an excipient like SiO2 or something like that, there's no difference, right? You can't differentiate. But what's interesting is when you construct the 3D model and you look at the morphology of crystalline structures in the 3D model, what they found is that the excipients that they're looking for physically make sheets, or the crystals themselves tend to be more flat in terms of the dynamics of their shape. And the API crystalline clusters or globes or structures tend to be more globular. And so by being able to take the 2D slices, construct a 3D model, and then segment those 3D structures using some modeling capability, and then quantify the relationship of that structure's morphology against this sort of baseline of, does it fall more in the API versus more in the excipient model, you're able to come up with a fairly accurate, fairly good model for whether something is API or excipient. Now, there are some obvious problems, right? Size becomes a question. The smallest of these clusters of these crystalline structures, it's harder to differentiate whether it's flat or globular. So there's continuing work there. But for the extent of the science that was needed to start to address that quantification, it's really been based on the three-dimensional morphology and three-dimensional quantification of those segmented structures. And it's also interesting that the same models that were used to do three-dimensional structures of those compounds, we were able to take into the translational imaging space and take MRI and PET data, and you can imagine constructing three-dimensional models of, let's say, tau aggregations or things like that in the brain. And so now you've got this idea that you can take the same ability to structurally recreate three-dimensional objects and run those same sorts of quantifications, whether it is a tau aggregate in the brain or an excipient or an API in a pill. At that point, the model is pretty independent of. And when you start layering additional features that are contextually dependent, like what is the underlying weight of the pill versus what is the density of water in the different constructs, you can then start to really tweak those models to do unique and interesting things. Some tablets have two APIs together. How do you handle? Absolutely right. And to be clear, this work that's being done is very exploratory. And to get to something when we deal with combinations and mixtures, and it has nothing to do with biologics at all, right? I mean, we're just talking about just small molecule compounds in this case. So there's certainly lots of areas for more experimentation. Do I think that you could rely on morphology for determining one API versus another API and the mixture distribution in there? Probably not, right? That would be a little more challenging. But who knows what other imaging modality you might be able to bring into play, as long as it is non-destructive of the tablet, and be able to then try those various different pieces or different approaches.
As a reminder, everyone, if you have a question, put it in the chat. Ryan, one of the things that's always struck me from the time that we met was how your vision has impacted AbbVie and how much you talk and improve the innovation at AbbVie. I'm wondering, I think of Andrew Ng and his thought of like this AI being the new electricity, right? What is that? AI has been around a long time, we know it, but these last couple of years have certainly been accelerated. What do you think, if you were to, in your crystal ball, what does that look like as far as what could be possible at AbbVie beyond what you're currently, talk about practical, applicable uses you have now? What might be possible if you're just dreaming even further?
So I'll answer it two ways. I'll answer it as a fanatic and I'll answer it as a skeptic. So
Excellent.
as a fanatic, the sky is the limit, right? To the extent that I can bring data together from novel areas in a way that lets me build predictive models or classification types of capabilities across that data at a scale and dimensionality that a human brain can't process, that enables just immense possibilities. Take, for example, that basic idea of that knowledge graph. What happens if I enrich that with all the genomic variants, right? What happens if I take and I tie actual patient clinical trial data? And what happens if I take population scale, right? What happens if I bring in real world data and I look at population scale around these things? A human brain, even the best human statisticians, would take years to try and wrangle hold the dimensionality of that types of problem. But I can throw 4,000 cores or 10,000 cores or 100,000 cores if I was really anxious about it at something like that, and be able to get in a matter of days or hours or minutes, hey, we predict that there is a link between compound X and outcome Y, and be able to then say, okay, well, if you predict that link, here's how we test it. Here's how we define it. So I think the biggest impact and the biggest potential, it's not the in silico medicine news bites about we developed a drug in 2 weeks. That's all well and good. It's actually what is going to be the impact to our scientists of them having the ability to say, I'm not going to do these 10 experiments because the predictions here tell me it's not going to do anything. I'm not going to validate. I'm going to focus on this one experiment, which is backed by this thing. And so when we think about improving the efficiency of the throughput and the pipeline for pharmaceutical production, how do I bring all of this data from later, collapse it down? We need to stop thinking about the data as the pipeline. The process of building a drug or making a drug might be a pipeline. I'm going to go through lead generation and target identification, go through these, but the data itself, we need to break that and bring all that data back in upon itself and make better, broader decisions at each step. That's the potential for pharma. Now, skeptic.
Yes.
The skeptic side is that we are not spending enough time anywhere. And I will make this blanket statement: in any industry, in any application of AI, we are not spending enough time around the ethics and bias questions, period. We just aren't. There is not enough fundamental research being done around that. And I don't just mean fundamental research about like, show me how this model is statistically flawed or it does carry bias. I mean the hard philosophical, metaphysical, ethical questions. And I go back actually to one of the best lines from Jurassic Park, when the book by Michael Crichton, and then it's in the movie as well, when the character Ian Malcolm says they spent so much time trying to figure out if they could, they never stopped to think if they should. And we need to do that. We need to think about this. And I think the paper published by our Google friends, if you've not read the paper about stochastic parrots, it should be required reading at this point. Because the fact is what is the real value of a 0.05% improvement in the performance of some model when it cost 3 weeks or a month's worth of the electricity for a small town to retrain that model? There is an implicit ethical question that we need to look at and understand. Otherwise, we're going to fall into the Bitcoin mining realm where we have farms of AI technology that's just chomping out incremental improvements in models and not focusing on how do we actually helping people's lives, helping people engage in real value creation and value preservation. And that value is their time. That value is their quality of life. It's not just about the money. So it's time for our computer science departments to start having real deep discussions with our philosophy departments and start bringing those people together.
Love that you went there. I couldn't get it out fast enough to say, what about ethics? Now, let's take a slightly different angle, and that is, it's related though. There are a lot of students on this call. Now, 10 years ago, you were talking about there were bioinformaticians, there were biologists, there were chemists, there were computer scientists separately. Even in your innovation lab here on campus at Illinois, what does that talent base look like to you now? And what might the next iteration of talent be in the ideal sense to AbbVie?
Right. Well, I will tell you that when I go to hire people for my team, here's what I look for. I think what kind of data scientist, and I'm going to use that term with a little bit of air quotes around it too, but with the type of data scientist that you want to be and the type of data scientist that a company is looking for or that is necessary in a given scenario is going to be different based on the culture of the company, based on the ultimate goals and things like that. My personal opinion, when I'm looking for folks on my team, I'm looking for bridges. I am looking for people who have a passion and interest and have been working in a specific domain. And it does not need to be bioinformatics. I have a theoretical physicist out of UPenn who's on my team. My background is in finance. We have folks on our team. One is a medical doctor, right? He never went to school for anything like that. But they have a passion for the domain, and they also have a passion and an aptitude for the technology. And if you can bridge those two spaces, you will have no shortage of opportunities to be able to find places to do that, to be that bridge that brings the technology understanding to the domain and bridges the gap where other people might have the technical, right? You might find somebody who is at a Google or at a lab facility or at a university who has deep academic, technical, and theoretical expertise, which is awesome. But you got to be able to apply it. If your goal is to impact change and drive value, you got to be able to help those people find the ways to apply it. And you have on the other side the people who have passions and want to apply things, but they need the technology help. They don't know what's really possible and what's not from the technology.
Great points. We talk about what's possible because people need to understand that. If there are any parting thoughts, any final thoughts for the audience today, Brian, what an outstanding presentation. What other thoughts might you have?
You know what, my parting thoughts are: be thankful for everything that we have in the opportunity to engage in this type of work and study and research. We are in a world that is in constant flux and change. And this is all technology that, if we do it the right way, will help us manage and deal with that. Whether it is predicting what route I should take from my GPS to avoid traffic that gives me a better commute home, or whether it's predicting the patient's journey based off of that radiology scan that's going to tell them you need to change X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, you're going to have this problem down the road. Like, no matter how we have that, how fortunate are we to be at a place where we, as the people engaged in this, have these skills and are developing these skills to help make that type of value and impact and change in the world around us.
Outstanding way to finish. Thank you so much. Brian Martin with AbbVie, thank you for being here today. Thank you everyone for joining on the call. The recording should be available in a couple of days, and look on our website, ai.ncsa.illinois.edu for that recording. Thanks again for being here. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.